folks, if you want to take your seats, we're going to get started momentarily. All right. Well, thank you so much. Welcome back to those of you who've been with us throughout the day, and welcome to those of you who are joining us for the first time tonight. Thank you for being here. I'm Ashley Olson, Executive Director here at the National Willa Cather Center. And we are so pleased tonight to welcome Dr. Molly Rozum for tonight's invited lecture. Before we do, I want to offer our thanks to Humanities Nebraska for their support of tonight's program, which made the event freely accessible to all. Humanities Nebraska is a statewide nonprofit organization inspiring and enriching personal and public life by offering opportunities to thoughtfully engage with history and culture. And they receive additional funding from the Nebraska Cultural Endowment. So if you enjoy this type of program, please consider supporting Humanities Nebraska and the National Willa Cather Center with a contribution. When planning for this year's conference, we knew that we had to mark the publication centenary of A Lost Lady, one of Cather's classic novels about life on the Great Plains. In both this novel and Cather's essay, Nebraska, Cather offers a glimpse into Nebraska's early history. She also contrasts those early days with criticisms of the materialistic world that replaced the frontier. So in designing the conference experience, it seemed, of course, we would be remiss not to draw attention to the first generations of settler society to grow up on the grasslands, the generations who grew up experiencing both native grassland habitat and settler agricultural grain lands and grazelands. So I want to thank Tracy Tucker from our conference planning team specifically for bringing Molly's book and her research to our attention. And as we prepare to discuss Plains settlement tonight, it also seems important to recognize that the National Willa Cather Center occupies the homelands of the Pari, the Washitagi, and the Osheti-Sakoween peoples, territory that was also inhabited by the Oto Missouria, Osage, and other indigenous peoples following the arrival of American and European settlers. As an organization, we're committed to honoring these people and recognizing their tribulations by providing a space for all people to engage in cultural exchange and learning. So as I mentioned, we are so pleased to welcome historian Molly Rozum, who is the author of Grasslands Grown, Creating Place on the U.S. Northern Plains and Canadian Plains. Rozum is co-editor of Equality at the Ballot Box, Votes for Women on the Northern Great Plains. She won the 2021 Blair and Linda Tremere Faculty Public Service Award at the University of South Dakota for her commitment to presenting history to local audiences. She is Associate Professor and Ronald R. Nelson Chair of Great Plains and South Dakota History at the University of South Dakota. Rozum earned a BA in American Studies from the University of Notre Dame and an MA in American Folklore and PhD in U.S. History from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She grew up in Mitchell, South Dakota, and her talk this evening is titled The Necessary Vision and the Necessary Skill, Willa Cather, Grassland Space, and the Cultural Aspirations of Settler Society's First Grasslands Grown Generations. So please give a warm spring conference welcome to Molly Rozum.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming, especially all of those of you who've been here all day since early this morning to come to one more big talk. I really appreciate it. I also want to thank, in particular, Ashley Olson, who just introduced me. Thank you for that generous introduction. Rachel Olson, where's Rachel? Right there. She's been my contact throughout the planning. Also the board of the National Willa Cather Center, all the sponsors who make a great event like this happen. It's so important and it's wonderful to see. And I also want to thank Wade Leake and Jay Yost for hosting me at the Kaylee House. They've been generous hosts and are looking after me. And so thanks to everybody for inviting me. I'm really thrilled to be here. I like to use maps in my work, and I'm influenced by cultural geography. And this map for me is of the biomass, the grasslands of North America. And I like it because it shows their extent at one time before settler society came in and built states out of it. I'm going to talk today a little bit first about my book project, just to give you a sense of what the whole book is about, and then I'm going to narrow down and actually talk about the literature, in particular one chapter of the book. The whole book project, called Grasslands Grown, explores the intersection of two related concepts: sense of place, which I argue comes from their relationship to the environment and the landscape, and regional identity, which is how they geographically place this land into the nation states of the United States and Canada. They create those regions from the late 19th century to the 1950s. I analyze in the book the personal and professional papers and publications of a group of people who were born in or carried to the northern grasslands as children, who lived there or remained in contact with the space throughout their lives. Willa Cather would be one of the oldest of this generation. Some of the youngest are born in the first decade of the 20th century. They grew up in South Dakota, North Dakota, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Montana, and Nebraska. I'm including Nebraska tonight. I'll say more about that later. I examined their experiences as children with landscapes and their thinking about land and the environment as adults. With few exceptions, such as Willa Cather and Wallace Stegner, these people were generally not important national figures. They achieved prominence in state or regional circles, or in their chosen professions, or in their ethnic groups. I argue generally that this generation's sense of place and their use of new geographic labels to express regional identity claimed the continent's northern grasslands on the plane of culture. This is settler colonialism for the post-pioneer generation. Their settler colonial parents claimed land physically through land laws and purchase. We're probably familiar with some of them: the Homestead Act, the Preemption Act, or purchasing railroad land. The Grasslands Grown generations, as I call them, processed and shifted personal experiences with land and atmosphere into cultural products: novels, autobiographies, paintings, and poetry. And they used the land for new crops and new animals, and they made new landmarks and new state and provincial and national parks. These cultural products all aim to imprint settler societies' interpretations of the environment and the space, a cultural claim to land, through their interpretation. This is what we call settler colonialism down the generations, which is contested, of course, by indigenous peoples who remain in the region and have their own stories about their land, their own sense of place. Agriculture transformed North America's northern grasslands during the lifetimes of settler society's first generations. The cover of my book, I just show it again here, reflects this transformation. It was actually an ad used by provinces in Canada to attract settlers north of the border. But you can see the emphasis there is they're trying to say, if you come and make a home in the 1800s, just look how quickly you can build this big farm, right? And notice the people difference between the two images. You've got a parent sort of starting out with the plow, and by the time the next one, you've got all the land planted to crops. Maybe there's some also grasslands in the far back, but you notice there's children in the picture, right? It's that generation that I focus on. I like this picture in particular. It's near Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, with the rivers, waters, and woods next to an agricultural field with shocks, or stooks as Canadians call bundles of grain in the field, next to unplowed grasslands. This suggests the sense of place settler children and young people acquired during this time period. Grasslands, native habitat, and agricultural fields became one and the same in a standard settler society remix of nature and culture. What I'm going to argue is that this generation in particular, who settled with their pioneer parents, they came into contact with lots of native grasslands. They also helped transform it by modern agricultural methods, planting it to crops, having cattle graze, and they became attached to both kinds of culture. They sort of remixed the regional environment to their own liking. By the middle of the 20th century, this generation referred to prairies and plains without regard to the amount of or even presence of native grasslands habitat within the total mix of plant species. We still call them the prairies, right? Still, key to this generation's sense of place is actual physical experience with native grasslands habitat, experiences that would be little or unavailable to succeeding generations. They had a unique experience in their placement. This is a pre-World War II sense of place, before what historians call the great disjuncture in agriculture after World War II, where you have a massive change in the way agriculture is produced. I'm going to talk about literature, but one of my favorite chapters is one on animals and children's relationships with animals, and I argue that this is a big part of their sense of place. Animals give them the rhythm of the place during this time. Another favorite chapter that I discuss is their relationship to grasslands growing up. How do they learn about the plants? And this is one painter, Honora Brown from Alberta, who went on to do all sorts of regional painting. Another later chapter 7 deals with how this generation came of age and then almost looked around and said, wait, where's our native grasslands? What happened to them? And a lot of these people start to preserve prairie plots. They start the momentum for actually saving part of that landscape because they valued it and grew up with it, even if they also wanted to produce agriculture. We start to see, and of course their memoirs, their literature, all of that is material that people who do want to reconstruct the prairie, or people who do want to know what it is like, we turn to their memoirs, we turn to their literature. Another aspect is this regional identity. The parents of settler society's grasslands grown generation migrated to a region in both Canada and the US called the New Northwest. That's totally dropped out of our culture, or the West. By the end of their lives, the next generation lived in the Prairie Provinces, or the Great Plains states, or the Middle West. When I study these people, I look at all of their documents and their reports and their novels to see, what are they calling it? Are they calling it the West? When did they start calling it the Great Plains? When did they start calling it prairies? Right? When does Middle West creep in? That's chapter 8 of the book. It's important that to remind us, as Indigenous literary scholar Elizabeth Cook Lynn has said, literature can and does successfully contribute to the politics of possession and dispossession. This grasslands grown generation created new stories of place to compete with ongoing Indigenous narrative traditions attached to the land imagined differently. They began to claim land, as I said, by placing their personal experiences into literature and art that further incorporated the region and place into settler nation states. I argue that these products helped the whole nations of Canada and the US to say, hey, that's what Great Plains is, that's what Middle West is, and thereby helps to place these regions in the nation in a settler colonial kind of way. And if you want me to say more in the question and answer about settler colonialism, I can. Another chapter in the book deals with settler-indigenous relations, where I try to get at how settlers understand what's happening to their neighbors. And on the Northern Plains, you have a lot of reservations. Okay, literary scholar Robert Thacker, where is he? He must be in the audience. He didn't know that the first part of my talk was gonna, he was in the first line. Literary scholar Robert Thacker has observed it took a generation who had grown up with, quote, overarching presence of grasslands landscapes, quote, incorporated into their very being for a literature of place to emerge. The lifespans of the writers considered here covered a broad period in literary history that saw national trends shift from romantic and local color fiction of the late 19th century to the narratives of realism and modern themes in the first half of the 20th century. In the early 20th century, the literary critic Carl Van Dorn commented on new authors who wrote with less optimism and more candor and used new forms, subjects, and language. He highlighted Main Street by Sinclair Lewis. The action of Main Street satirically, if more lovingly than often recalled, portrayed the culture of Lewis's boyhood hometown, Sauk Center, Minnesota, located, I would argue, on the eastern edge of the northern grasslands. Van Dorn argued that Hamlin Garland, author of Main Traveled Roads, with many stories set in South Dakota, offered, quote, dissent from average notions about the pioneers. Van Dorn thought Willa Cather, author of a then already important Nebraska novels, such as O Pioneers from 1913 and My Antonia from 1918, focused uniquely on what he called human character, conveying both uneducated people and what he called a higher type, with a notable balanced independence from all literary forms. Garland, Cather, Lewis also inspired writers from their region interested in portraying the northern grasslands in literature. The aspiring young writer Albertan Wilfred Eggleston noted that Garland's stories, quote, might have been drawn from Alberta farms instead of Dakota or Iowa. He hoped more than one Canadian Garland might emerge from the thousands of boys on our Canadian prairie to fix the image of our pioneer days, end quote. A 1924 column he wrote for the Lethbridge Herald in Alberta, he cited Willa Cather's My Antonia and O Pioneers alongside Garland as authors who he considered, quote, the first interpreters he encountered whose prose and verse adequately described the prairie. I love that word, adequately. Eggleston devoted his newspaper column to finding prairie literature. New fiction and poetry by grasslands writers shared some of the preoccupations of their modern literary counterparts with World War I, consumerism and materialism, and changing social and moral values. But I argue northern grasslands writers used a distinguishing post-settlement, next-generation, place-centered framework. Modern grassland writers critiqued social life centered around small towns, but also life related to homesteads in the countryside, distinctly portraying the two, towns and countryside, becoming entwined. They acknowledged cultural conformity, but geography, grasslands environments, and settler society's adjustment to the land in agricultural terms had as much power in their prose. The mixing of romantic, popular, realistic, and modern genres seems key generally to an emergent northern grasslands literature in the first half of the 20th century. So tonight, the rest of my talk, I'm going to raise some themes from 4 novels. I discuss many more and more individuals in the whole book, but these are from chapter 6. Robert McAlmon, who grew up in part in South Dakota and Minneapolis, published Village in 1924. Wilfred Eggleston, the young man I just quoted, published The High Plains in 1938. And Wallace Stegner, who spent important formative years in Saskatchewan, published On a Darkling Plain in 1940. And finally, the Willa Cather novel, that most attracted me for inclusion in my Grasslands Grown history project was One of Ours, which she published in 1922. It is a nice coincidence for me that we are this year, 2023, celebrating the 100th anniversary of Cadler's Pulitzer Prize Award. I'll end with some discussion of the difficulties faced by writers in portraying northern grasslands, space and culture acceptable to the literary establishment. So perhaps here I should point out a couple of things. I'm a historian, as you may have gathered by some of the delivery here already. I care not so much about what makes good literature as what is literature that expresses a cultural disposition caused by growing up in a certain place. How does it express who people think they are? So what I'm saying here is I'm interested in Willa Cather, but I'm interested in all sorts of people in the Dakotas and Montana, Wyoming and Saskatchewan who attempted to write a novel that we may or may not think are literary, but that people in their generation got a lot of meaning out of and came to cherish for the content and for what they were trying to express. The other thing that I was so thrilled to be invited here is that I actually had to cut some, I'm afraid to say this, I hope you don't have like oranges or things to throw, but I had to cut some of my Willa Cather stuff and analysis from my book because of various other publisher concerns. She's in my book, and I talk a lot about her as being this influence on all these young writers. But here I'm going to talk about One of Ours, and I went back and looked at some of my original writing. So I just felt like I needed to make that, confession up front. Okay, so how many people have heard of Robert McAlmon? Maybe a couple people, right? In 1924, the little-known then and today South Dakota writer Robert McAlmon published Village with his own Paris-based Contact Publishing Company. In some ways, it reflects and engages with Sinclair Lewis's Main Street. Set in the fictional town of Wentworth, North Dakota, the autobiographical novel evoked the lives of turn-of-the-century residents of Madison and Wentworth in eastern South Dakota that McAlmon, born in 1896, knew growing up. The dominance of cropped acres, shrinking wetlands, and, quote, prairies covered in high-dried weeds, end quote, signals the post-1900 eastern northern grasslands location. Now farmers ship great quantities of commodities to the cities. Settlers seemingly control space. Indigenous peoples are consigned to reservations. Settlement is both a generation old and ongoing. Characters seek homesteads once again farther west in the Dakotas and eastern Montana and Canada, unlike in the 1880s and 1890s when McAlmon called the famine years, when climatic hardship caused mass exodus of families from the farm and village. Implicating the grasslands and settler culture that grew his village, McAlmon argued, quote, morality based on property and sex limited the social condition of the then entwining townspeople and farmers. The village revolves around the machinations of an it crowd signaled by young women. Beauty qualifies one to be it, but beauty is judged by the, quote, corn-fed health look. With family wealth, occupation, and religion mixed into the calculation. The achievements and activities of the young people substitute for a mature community with established and professional cultural institutions. McAlmon accomplished his modern revolt from the village looking with bite through the eyes of bright young people looking to their future, not as in Lewis's Main Street, those who return to live as the next middle-aged generation of leading families in town. McAlmon focused on younger people almost solely. Peter Reynolds, McAlmon's alter ego, a teenager, who speculates he would, quote, kind of like to be only a hobo, a high-class one, and travel all over the world, which was very much like the McAlmon who lived in Paris at the time he was writing this story. He lived in Paris. And he relates much of the activity of the village. McAlmon's characters continually bemoan the dullness of Wentworth and fear that they will petrify if they stay. Townspeople have invested in the countryside, and wealthy farmers have taken over the villages. Better financed settlers achieve success because of the timely farmland purchases during droughts. A mere 5 farm families dominate the countryside in this village. One farm family already operates as equals with the townspeople, inviting them out to their homestead farm. The original claim, they distinguish the homestead farm, the original claim, as opposed to all the other farms that they've acquired as they've expanded. Another family, quote, virtually owned and controlled all of the businesses and production of the village and the farm community about them. Soon, retiring farmers become the most reliable source of new village residents. The wealthy Angus family challenges the town's social order by moving from the farm into a big, old, deteriorating house. The substantial 10-room brick mansion built by long-gone pioneers from the East represented, quote, only a legend of New England cultures and respectability, end quote, that settler society once thought could be transplanted to the grasslands. Settler society now has a revised idea of wealth. McAlmon moved beyond the romanticized to reveal a village fully connected to grasslands, countryside, and the modern world. As McAlmon phrased it, quote, the spaciousness of the country and the freedom of young animal life about permitted school children to escape too cramping influences of petty minds if they had instincts of there being a larger-minded world outside the village, end quote. McAlmon's prose reveals young people's innocent sexual questioning very much alive in the turn-of-the-century villages of the northern grasslands, as they were part of the conversations occurring in Greenwich Village in New York when he lived there and wrote of these grasslands people. McAlmon's teenage characters, Peter and Jean, for example, discuss adolescent hormonal changes and sexual maturity. Peter even contemplates his affection for Jean. Still, he wonders whether the attraction might only be part of adolescence. Another college-age friend of Peter's dreams of kissing a male friend and wakes up feeling life, quote, mystifying. The grown-up young people, both male and female, discuss countrified-looking girls who fuss and cuddle, birth control, sex between people perceived to be elderly, adulterous affairs, and you can imagine those kids talking, right? You know, adulterous affairs and suicides, and indicate the occurrence of abortion. McAlmon's literature engaged in the new attention to sex encouraged by modern naturalistic writers in ways that resonated with his grasslands upbringing. Although these individuals grew to adulthood in an agricultural economy in a region rising rural, McAlmon's work reminds us that they were not isolated from ideas percolating across the continent. McAlmon's literary strategy united a modernist turn away from the prohibition against discussing sex and tried to make the subject accessible through the eyes of innocent but realistic rural children and adolescents. So some takeaways here. McAlmon showed the connections between rural grasslands and modern life using crisp, precise, direct prose, collapsing frontier mythology in the process of doing so. His work highlighted rural and remote young people and children and showed them connected to the world, not isolated on the frontier. His portrayal of the small town shows environmental adjustment and industrial farming beginning to create the grassland small towns and culture we recognize today. And I like this picture of McAlmon with William Carlos William, another writer, partly because, and it's hard, but it was one of the only ones I could find, he looks so young there. This is when he went to New York City. This is what he looked like, this young guy here. And that's a more recent publication of Village, but for many reasons, which I'll get to at the end of the talk, McAlmon was not widely read in the United States. His books were not allowed, either they were through censorship, they were not permitted in the States. He had a harder time finding a publisher, and so it really was only till the 1990s that his books started to be read in the United States, and people questioned their quality. Turning from a town scene to a rural scene, I want to look at the novel The High Plains published in 1938, set in early 20th century Alberta and authored by Wilfred Eggleston. Born in 1901, Eggleston went on to be a well-known journalist based in Toronto. In the novel, he tracked the history of his own failed family farm, homestead, in the form of a boy's adventure story, though I think he was aspiring for more literariness than that and more adult literature, but it comes across as a boy's novel. He created an alternate reality in which farming success came from understanding the true nature of the grasslands. Newly opened All Rolling Prairie lures the Barnes family as it did the real Eggleston family from England. A murder entwines with the family homestead story as the boy Eric's life choices, kind of Eggleston's alter ego. Someone shoots the Swede Olaf Bjornsson, and everyone suspects the hermit Sylvester Huck, who collects rocks and shells on long grasslands walks instead of farming. So he's suspicious because he's not farming. Eric Barnes plays a role in helping Huck flee from the scarlet-coated mounted police across the border to Montana, and in exonerating Huck after the latter's arrest in Arizona. Neither the boy nor the man in the end, both suspected by Mounties, turn out to be guilty. As Eric frees Huck through his detective work, Huck plays a role in releasing both Eric and his family from the failed homestead that they're living on. Huck receives a several $1,000 government settlement from his unwarranted arrest, half of which he gives to Eric, who had early on told his parents he was not going to farm. The boy in turn provides a down payment on a new 80-acre irrigated Alberta farm for his parents, which allows his older brother, a Great War veteran, to return to farming. So taking him off the semi-arid, dry plains off a tiny homestead. Meanwhile, Eric, similar to Eggleston at this point in his life, leaves to travel and plans to go to the university. The ending mirrors the real-life big move-out of southern Alberta in the 1920s, when many of those who settled on the semi-arid short grasslands, including Eggleston's parents, left after years of drought. Eggleston thought the provincial-backed irrigation project a type of restitution for the faulty official land policy that lured his parents to the grasslands. The end of Eggleston's High Plains makes clear exoneration of his father. The High Plains highlights Eggleston's attachment to the northern grasslands he experienced as a boy. So it's problematic, and he's frustrated over the failed homestead, but he loves the prairie. The overriding tone of the novel is joy, a type of cultural ownership of the space. Eric loves the prairie landscapes of southern Alberta and the, quote, strange country down there near the border, like a miniature painted desert as they have in the Dakotas, end quote. More than anyone, Eric identifies with Huck, it turns out he's a retired geologist who as a young man had worked on the boundary survey between the United States and Canada. In the novel, in, quote, secret visits, Huck opens up for Eric the fascinating worlds of geology, astronomy, paleontology, and archaeology. Huck is the man Eggleston wished he would have known while growing up. Eggleston inhabited both the boy Eric, attached to the prairie, but he refuses to farm, and the man Sylvester Huck, who understands intellectually and scientifically the northern grasslands, and who has the knowledge Eggleston acquired only by lifelong study, an almost obsession with the grasslands ecology of his one-time family homestead, despite the fact that he lived most of his life in Toronto and Ottawa. Couple takeaways. Egwe's novel highlights both attachment to native grasslands and tame or agricultural lands, the absolute beauty and nature of the place. His parents, who lived in Alberta on this irrigated 80-acre farm, never went back to the homestead, never went back. Eggleston went back in the 30s, the 50s. He wrote 2 boy novels. He wrote a book of poetry. He wrote a history of it, the homestead, and he studied the grasslands up until he died in the mid-1980s. Like, he had this obsessive, connection to that beauty, to that land. The novel conveys the second takeaway. The novel conveys the inner turmoil and conflicted feelings this generation had about fathers and parents for bringing them to a place to farm and small plots of land that could not lead to success. Only homesteads that absorbed departing neighbors' lands could find success. Eggleston argues for his generation that it was okay to leave the place, to quit a place impossible to live in by the original but ill-conceived plan of the founders. He wrote to explain for his generation that families failed due to what Wallace Stegner called the iron inflexibilities of the plains environment, made more impossible by what in time was called power farming, the rise of modern industrial agriculture. His novel told his generation they had gained important appreciation for grasslands and nature, agricultural land from their childhood experiences. This is a picture of Wallace Stegner when he first started writing his novels, and also of him as a little boy on the Frenchman River in Saskatchewan, on a homestead he grew up on. His book, On a Darkling Plain, explores family homesteading experiences similar to those of Eggleston, but in southwestern Saskatchewan. He focuses tightly on the effects of that experience on his intellectual development. On the surface, Stegner's first full-length novel, his least favorite, never allowing it to be published again, centers on the existential struggles of a World War I veteran raised in British Columbia. The character Vickers spent his boyhood in a lush lotus land of Vancouver, but exiles himself to the remote prairie of a Montana border, which is the same place Stegner homesteaded, and visits the village of White Mud, which is the same town that Stegner frequented east in. Vickers' angst comes vaguely from war experiences in France and ill-defined modern forces of cultural conformity. On a Darkling Plain allowed Stegner to work with his boyhood memories of Saskatchewan's semi-arid grasslands to explore his own 1930s inner turmoil about the place he felt marked him. Stegner wondered about the deculturation of settlers and himself on the northern grasslands, thinking of his boyhood utterly without painting, sculpture, conversation, travel, libraries, bookstores, and even language, and almost without music or theater. He said, "I was charged with getting in a single lifetime from scratch what some people inherit as naturally as they breathe the air." As Stegner phrased it, quote, "The dream of the founders is often the dream of the full life as well as the dream of material success." Under pressures of depopulation in small towns unable to sustain cultural institutions, specifically educational, thought Stegner, the lower tastes drive out the higher. As much as Stegner loved the grasslands, he thought it a good place to be a boy and as unsatisfying place to be a man, which is not true. He visited and he went back several times. He again wrote of this place over and over and over again. He too had the same attachment to native grasslands and agricultural lands. His inner struggle centered on what isolated life might do to the development of a person and therefore to society. So affected, could they measure up beyond the grasslands? So affected, could they convey the grasslands in literature? Just so you think it's not all men, there are many women writing novels too. And Parsons wrote both a novel, kind of a romance novel, and an autobiography here. And she wrote about her father's failed agricultural dream and her actual joy, as you can see in these quotes, about growing up on the plains in her two books. In the novel, she gives, in her autobiography, she explains the year after her father left the homestead, he died. In the novel, she creates a happy ending where they move into a sod house and they have a breathtaking vista of distance. Finally, we get to some Willa Cather. In her Pulitzer Prize-winning novel, One of Ours, Willa Cather, born in 1873, examines the grasslands from a perspective of children of successful plant pioneers. I've been talking about failed small homesteads, yet she struggled with the same deculturation problem that Stegner and Eggleston noted too. Nat Wheeler had known, quote, Nebraska when the Indians and the buffalo were still about, and he and his wife once lived in a dugout. Through homesteading, buying, and leasing land, the Wheeler family grew rich. The family rented out extra land and employed the hands to work most of the rest. Neighbors respected Nat Wheeler, but some of the country people considered him a land hog. The Wheelers compared to the large 5 farmer families surrounding the village McAlmond depicted. In the novel, the Wheeler boys have all come of age to take their places in the modern agricultural economy, transforming the northern grasslands. Claude's younger brother, Ralph, believes in progress. He purchases any new mechanical invention or the most recent model of any device, from the latest phonograph to an electric cream separator, as soon as possible. The purchase of a gramagrass ranch for Ralph in Colorado and plans to pass the Nebraska land to Claude marked the final departure of the Wheeler family from the East. Nat Wheeler still owned an inherited Maine farm, wealth he now invested in Colorado. Claude's older brother, Bayless, runs a successful farm implement business in town. Bayless's impulsive offhand purchase of the big house on the hill near town, built by frontier day New Englanders who had tried to become great cattlemen, signals the rise of a new grasslands West culture. He planned to tear it down. The Wheeler family represents the emergence of a settler society culture that will displace old West dreams captured in the circulating stories of New Englanders who wanted to become great cattlemen. Even Claude does not reject the family wealth. The opening scene finds him in a snip because his father would not let him drive the automobile to town for the circus. Instead, Claude would end up in town dirty and smelly from a mule-driven wagon. On a day when many people would be in town to see, Nat Wheeler, his father, wanted his son to bring in the 4 hides he, Nat, personally had cured to be sold. Claude scoffed at his father's ritual of theft, a nod to pioneer culture. By Claude's thinking, first, a blizzard and wanton carelessness had killed the 4 steers, and second, the price they would bring would not half pay for the time his father spent preparing the skins for market. Claude felt constrained by such a culture that would not allow him to use wealth to take his bohemian friend to lunch or to take a first-class Pullman railroad car for a daylight journey. These luxuries lacked materiality and therefore constituted putting on airs. And Claude loved the transformation settler colonialism brought about on the northern grasslands. He felt the country became most itself in harvest. From the train window, he saw corn, wheat, oats, alfalfa, and pasture land. He watched every farm pass by. Claude took refuge in the family timber claim, also a settler colonial constructed landscape. Still, he did not want erasure of nature, but a remix of nature, culture, conservation, preservation, and success, wealth that can preserve and conserve. He wanted more from wealth than material things. Before taking over the main Wheeler place, Claude spends a couple of terms at a college in Lincoln, the state's capital. Cather provides a picture of what Claude desires on the farm, through a German family with 5 sons Claude meets while in Lincoln. In contrast to the Big Wheeler Ranch, the brothers live with their mother in a rambling wooden house. The wealth this family owns flows from culture. The house is full of hard-used books. The family debates and discusses theater and contemporary affairs. He is taken aback when he discovers this family, quote, spent their money on themselves instead of on machines to do work and machines to entertain people. For the first time, Claude used words that had never crossed his lips. If he caught himself, he would blush and stammer for fear that he might mispronounce words. Claude's family, by contrast, seemed silent. Unable to finish college because of farm duties, Claude returns home but soon felt hurt from being lost in another kind of life in which ideas played but little part. In the end, Claude makes a patriotic escape to the Great War his father could not disallow. The real uncertainties of a land subject to drought produced a self-imposed asceticism that drew attention to material things by unnatural either obsessive frugality or obsessive spending or symbolic spending, I think Cather was trying to say. Some takeaways here. Cather drew an alternate frontier reality by focusing on a successful farm family and a capable, bright young man who loved the farm and the agricultural landscape constructed by settler society, but nevertheless leaves disenchanted with post-frontier forms of success that excluded intellectual culture. Claude Wheeler wanted, using Stegner's words, the full life as well as the dream of material success. Showing Cather's influence on this generation, Wallace Stegner mentioned her novel, One of Ours, when he wrote of the similarities between the revolt of the village and the revolt from the American frontier dream as themes in American writing. For Northern Grasslands writers, writing about the village meant revolting from a frontier they found mythological to their experience. Eagleston, Stegner, Parsons came of age in the same grasslands transforming to grainlands context as Cather, if at a different point in time, because it took more than one generation to incorporate the grasslands, particularly the semi-arid grasslands, into Canada and the United States. I want to talk a little bit about Robert McAlmon's struggle to create modern literature, go back to the first novel that I mentioned, using Northern Grasslands as a suggestion for what it might reveal about a generation struggling to assert place identity through literature. Unlike Sinclair Lewis or Willa Cather, McAlmon's work did not become well known until the late 20th century, and then mostly in academic circles. Nevertheless, most of the major writers in the arts communities of Paris and New York City found McAlmon promising. The writer William Carlos Williams, who knew McAlmon in the early 20s in New York City, described him as an abortive genius who believed good writing driven home would do much to make life worth living. Wintering in Australia with his wife Hadley, the novelist Ernest Hemingway wrote to McAlmon about the latter's novel Village. Village is absolutely first-rate and damn good reading. We're all reading it down here, and everybody thinks it's a knockout. Hemingway's praise of Village may have been more support designed to encourage a fellow writer. May have been mere support to encourage a fellow writer, his friend and publisher. That year, McAlmon's own Parish Contact Publishing Company issued Hemingway's first collection of fiction, 3 stories and 10 poems, when the latter was still unknown. But his opinion was probably sincere. The poet Ezra Pound offered essentially the same judgments. A good piece about the American West, he said of Village. From Paris, Gertrude Stein wrote, McAlmon, I have been reading Village. I find your people to be as I knew them and as I know them, and America as I know it. Other critics compared him to Sinclair Lewis and Ernest Hemingway. Still, critics debated at the time and since whether his laziness, carelessness, talent, bad luck, ill timing, impatience with revision, or problems of the literary establishment held back McAlmon. He was hard to place. Although Ford Maddox Ford, the writer and editor of the short-lived Paris journal Transatlantic Review, famously classified McAlmon as, quote, one of the worst writers he knew in Paris, a McAlmon-authored story appeared in the first issue of that journal as part of the tradition of, and I wrote it up there because it's kind of hard to say, that West, Middle West by West of which we have been taught to and do expect so much. And then says, but geography is not our strongest point. It's like they don't know where to place McAlmon. They don't know where he's trying to get at. He's like Hemingway, he's like Lewis, but his work is different. And I think this is a problem. This is a problem for him. And then also he tends to be censored a little bit because he addresses some of these sexual themes. A telling letter exchanged between William Carlos Williams and McAlmon suggests some of what McAlmon might have struggled against in the publishing world. Williams referred to an unnamed text in a personal letter chastising McAlmon's apparent ignorance of cows. Okay, it's kind of funny. Look it up in an encyclopedia, Williams wrote. You're a hell of a farmer. Didn't you ever hear of a cow giving 30 quarts of milk? Really? He went on to explain that 40 or even 60 quarts might come from a good cow. Williams eventually answered his own inquiry, realizing, quote, I guess you only knew those half-starved Western wiregrass-eating hat racks. Indeed, no one questioned McAlmon's almost photographic depictions of places, people, and animals. Hemingway observed McAlmon's documentary impulse to be the central flaw in his fiction. He said, Mac worked too close to life. Yet sometimes McAlmon's work seemed not to ring true. An encyclopedia of the period may have even proved McAlmon's perceptions of cows to be false, but not because he did not get the amount of milk produced correct, but because his experiences with northern grasslands agriculture had not yet been incorporated into the accumulation of knowledge about American regions. I argue in the book, McAlmon might have been part of an emerging modern literary grasslands West if the Main Street could have heard the margins speaking. Northern grasslands authors of this generation sought to create new imagery to match new storylines of a modern post-frontier world. No small task. The Canadian prairie scholar Dick Harrison noted the place's authors, quote, lacked the verbal traditions upon which literature builds. Critic Robert Thacker described Willa Cather's career as a classic example of, quote, the Western native ever struggling with the imaginative demands of Western space. Seemingly understood, wrote Thacker, to those who grew up in the environment, the feelings remained still, quote, strange and daunting, and ever at odds with the conventional aesthetics, even after critics praised Cather's work. Writers wrestled to convey grassland senses of place. Stegner's Darkling Plain references the artistic struggle quite openly. World War I veteran Vickers explains, that is the magnificence of this country. It takes my breath sometimes, the sweep of it, but I can't get a flash of it into poetry that satisfies me. It was an image too big for him. North Dakota poet Clell Gannon, North Dakota poet Clell Gannon expressed the same. All is so still, so big, I can spare speak. I only dare to think. Such thoughts as have no counterparts in words. They're struggling to come up with how to describe their experience. McAlmon captured the challenge of perception in a different way. A young man stood looking at the grassy prairie stretched rollingly horizonward on all sides of him, pondering the question, was the horizon farther away or nearer to him because of the endlessness of space? He desired the wideness of space fuse into his intuitions. As late as 1962, Wallace Stegner explained, quote, all the forces of culture and snobbery are against your writing by ear and making contact with you and your own natural audience. Publishers found the sparseness of the northern grasslands population unattractive markets. Willa Cather, too, felt defensive about the Eastern establishment's lack of interest in the grasslands as a subject matter, yet the East of cultural criticism and acceptance pulled her to it. Thacker has argued that Cather's ambivalence came from being, quote, schooled to see the East as a cultural mecca, end quote. She knew her choice of Nebraska as a setting for literature would be seen as distinctly Class A. Apparently, after she published O Pioneers in 1913, someone asked her, quote, how did you come to write about that flat part of the Prairie West, which not many people find interesting? Can you imagine standing there at and someone saying that to you? Worse, one New York critic wrote, I simply don't care, damn, what happens in Nebraska, no matter who writes about it. You can just see Cather, trying to break in and hearing this. But residents of Cather's generation and beyond did desire a fiction set in the towns and on the farms to read about all the little details she related and to discuss all the struggles that they had. A collective claim to grassland sense of place can be seen in the turn among the post-pioneer generations to words such as our, my, and mine, referring to particular locations and using indigenous and native as self-referential terms. You see here a poem by Clell Gannon, This Land is Mine, they're claiming it. Laura Salverson, I haven't talked a lot about immigrant writing, but wrote a great Icelandic novel and also claims place. When the Albertan Wilfred Eagleton spoke of fiction writers Willa Cather and Hammond Garland, he thought, saying this specifically about them, quote, here's the West, our Canadian West as well as the American West, not as aliens have seen it in transient visits, but as painted by a native with the necessary vision and the necessary skill, end quote. The little magazine founded by McAlmon and William Carlos William in New York City in 1920 desired to publish art representative of indigenous experience and relations. They're talking about the grasslands grown. When Cather, Stegner, Eagleston, McAlmon, and others embedded grasslands experiences into their literary works. They bound a broader settler population to common narratives. They worked out all their experiences and their frustrations and their joys and their struggles. Their works helped their generation understand their pioneer parents and their struggles with intellectual life. Their works helped give subsequent settler society generation the words, the phrases, and the forms to adequately, to use Wilfred Eggleston's not very exciting term, describe the prairie. But they were teaching their fellow peers how to write and think about the prairie. The authors helped place the prairies, plains, the grasslands into national literatures in ways that gave meaning to settlers. This literature also worked to transfer the region discursively to settler society and settler nation states and challenged indigenous ways of organizing and relating space. This literature is settler colonialism down the generations, but it's also sense of place and true regional identities for those that came to make this place a home. Thank you, and now I'll take some questions.
Okay, I think so. I didn't write it, so. Oh, got another one. Thank you. No. Which one did I hit there? That one. No, we'll just.
Can you hear me? No. We'll share.
Okay, well, our first question, and maybe our last. Would you like to say anything about children of homesteaders placemaking as opposed to Native American removal or erasure? What do you make of Cather's erasure of Native Americans, and how maybe it compares to Stegner or other Plains writers? So I think there's a couple questions here. Yeah. Do you want to say anything about children of homesteaders placemaking as opposed to Native American removal or erasure?
Yeah, placemaking for children. One of the things that I found in studying, I actually have children's letters that I read in a different chapter in the book, and children learned a lot about the environment and dug themselves in by following animals and either working with animals, horses, cows, farm animals, but also prairie dogs and birds, and they were all over the landscape. And that's one of the ways that they dug in, created place. They learned the details of the prairie. They weren't just looking at the horizon. They loved the details. And it's those animals, like I said, I think give this generation a special relationship to the land because they rode horses. They were behind wagons. That's a way the rhythm that you have across the land gave them a particular way to view the plains, right? Just as you speed by with cars, that's one way of looking at it. Imagine those same scenes going by with animals. And then animals, of course, will react to things in the landscape. So that's one way children create a place. And that chapter is one of the chapters that people really like. And then also all the plants and the growth, they learn that. Gives them this attachment that they later turn to and then try to conserve part of the prairie. So that's one.
how about in relation to Native American removal or erasure? Placemaking as homesteaders placemaking as opposed to Native American removal or erasure within that.
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure what you're getting at there, but I think for homesteaders, obviously building up their places and putting their labor in the land, help them learn about the qualities of the soil, the climate, the temperature. All of those experiences gave them a sense of place. A lot of them did not consider Native Americans. A lot of times, treaties had removed them to special places, to reservations. One of the things that I found interesting, though, is those settlers of this generation, the children who grew up near reservations and in towns with indigenous peoples, and cared about the environment and learned about the environment from their interactions with natives, either at local fairs or visiting reservations, they tended to develop a unique environmental ethic that sort of combined prairie, agriculture, and conservation. So they were influenced. And I for a long time, I thought that if you lived closer to a reservation, you had more opportunity to do this, and there were more opportunities to learn from one another in this next generation as indigenous peoples started to adjust to reservations and resist settler colonials in their area, and make reservations are originally designed to be temporary institutions. And instead, natives made them the seats of modern sovereignty that are still there today and still asserting for their own narratives of place. I'm not sure I answered that question exactly, but maybe there's another one to help clarify.
Sure. What do you make of Cather's erasure of Native Americans and how it compares to Stegner or other Plains writers?
Oh, a Cather's erasure. Yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that fully in comparison to Stegner or other places. Yeah. Cather and Stegner and
other Plains writers that you might know of, or maybe some of the writers that you talk about in your book, some of the memoirists. How do they deal with Native American culture? How does that impact their own sense of place?
Yeah. Well, there's one guy in particular who works with agricultural seeds, and he lives up in North Dakota, Bismarck, and his name is George Will, and his father ran a seed business. And through some college experiences with archaeology, he became one of the first archaeologists to study Native American Earth Lodge villages of the Mandan up near Bismarck. And over a life, he started out thinking there weren't very many natives around, and then over his lifetime, he came to work very closely with natives, and he was convinced that successful farming would come through using native seeds developed by native women farmers. And he learned a lot from natives and worked with them, and I would say he goes the farthest on a continuum towards sort of being a model for good relations. On the other hand, there are some of the memoirs and some of these settlers or books it's as if natives are erased. Others encounter natives periodically, or they work with natives and come to know them some, but there's barriers. There's a whole continuum of race relations that I see in this generation. And one of the things that I think with the book is it does give you different models of how people have tried to understand what their own presence in the region has done to natives, and how they might learn from natives, how natives had knowledge about the grasslands, about the climate, about the environment that settler society needed in order to adjust. And I think the ones who were most successful, figured that out.
Some of the stories that you were using were really fascinating. This one works now. George Will, for example, who was, as you mentioned, was collecting seeds and made it into his business, right? The native corns that he was.
Mm-hmm.
Where did you find these stories? How did you locate some of these memoirs? And
well, I went around to all the local, state, and provincial archives and looked for people who had collections that met the age categories I was looking for, meaning that they had to come as children or be, be born in the region. And I looked for collections that had a lot of writing, either novelists or, in the case of George Will, it was a businessman. But one of the things that I found is he wrote in the Seed Company letter, an annual letter every year reflecting on his life. And he also did all this archaeology work in which he wrote lots of reports. He had lots of correspondence. So I basically looked by age, and I went to North Dakota and South Dakota and Montana and the Prairie provinces to find these people.
Fascinating, thank you. You mentioned a remix of culture, nature/culture, agriculture, wilderness. How does this relate to Cather's idea of land ethic? Does it show growth from, say, O Pioneer's idea of land ethic?
I think, to use the one of ours and Claude Wheeler, or even a Lost Lady, I think that there's an appreciation for, Cather comes to appreciate that, yes, you should make a living at farming, and this is good, and like I said, all these kids grow up loving grain and farmlands and all the other, and everything to do with agriculture. However, they still like the marshes, or they want their decisions to be sustainable. That's a word we use today, but they don't want to destroy nature or animals just for the final profit to buy the latest new gadget, which was happening in some of the brothers in the one of our story. And in some ways, this ethic, it relates to two things. First of all, the Great Plains and the fact that the northern grasslands were kind of in this middle area, right, where we have many years that we have enough rain to raise agriculture without irrigation. These were things this generation was just figuring out. Many people came out here thinking that, it would be just like the East. We'd have enough rain. We could have these big intensive farms. As the generations figured out how this weather could be mercurial and how the further west you went, the trickier it became in terms of your annual rainfall, that's one transformation that's happening. There's a second transformation happening, and that's what I mentioned at the very beginning about the great disjunction in agriculture, where you've got tractor farming coming in, and then it changes dramatically with World War I, with chemical farming, and even more machinery. And that makes farms even larger. And I think Willa Cather's sense of place, this generation's sense of place, still envisions a place where you have those stooks in the field, or maybe hay bales. It's that remix, but it's a mix that includes prairie spaces, riverine forests, as well as agriculture. It's a distinctly pre-World War II sense of place and ethic, right, that they'd like to hang on to, and it becomes increasingly more difficult in the 20th century to do that, right? And I think a lot of this generation, all of a sudden, they start to get a little older, and they realize, wait, where is my prairie? Where'd it go, right? As agriculture takes off, and then they start to think more about conservation and preservation. They write books about, the plants that they knew. It catches them off guard, and they're very much surprised that they've completely transformed the land. So in terms of an ethic that way, I think Cather is sort of, what am I trying to say? You know, they want to settle the place. They want to raise modern agriculture. They want to be successful farmers, but they also want some of the nature that they first encountered when they came here before they had it all under the plow, right? That's kind of what I mean by a remix. They don't want to, they do want to plow it, right? I want to make that clear. And they do have a sense of place that's related to farming and agriculture and those smells, as well as grasslands. If that answers it.
I think so. We have just a couple more questions, unless anybody else has any. I'm just going to read this. That's on the related to the cows. That's the first line. Lack of knowledge about the grasslands. Do you think the Great Plains authors still struggle with being misunderstood?
Yes.
Being understood.
Yes, I do. I think publisher, you know, Cather struggled with that. You heard some of the commentary she got. Wallace Stegner, as late as the 70s, he said he was testing, you know, whether or not he needed to have a place in New York so he could constantly be in touch with big editors, right? Think of the Plains population. Think of the, you know, and particularly Northern Plains, but Nebraska on north, and the depopulation that's going on. Hard to have an infrastructure of publishing. Also, as I was trying to convey there at the end with somebody like Robert McAlmon, like if you don't have an editor or you don't have you know, people that can encourage a writer and understand what they're trying to do, don't have any experience with the place, it's much harder for the writer to become placed. It's much harder for them to be published. And then a publisher is also calculating how many people are going to buy those books, how many people are going to buy the, you know, all of that, you know. So if you live in a big population state, you know, there's the chances of having a bigger audience. So I think for a variety of reasons, it is hard. That's why some of these local presses that have been mentioned, the earlier, who was on the poetry panel? Becky, yeah, and she was mentioning all of those, you know, publishers and how important they are to maintaining culture, and I think that's what Cather wanted. And University of Nebraska Press, who published this book, had an editor who was very interested in worked with me and checked in with me every year. How are you doing on that book? I want to get, you know, I think this is important to get it out there. And I think local presses, I think they're important precisely because having an audience, right, matters, right? Having an institution like this matters, where people come and partake. And I think this is what Claude Wheeler wanted. This is what Cather wanted. I think it's hard for any writer, any writer, but I think there are stereotypes about Plains writing. There's stereotypes about frontier. There, you know, to get in the real detail and the real struggles, which you heard about. Some of them were hard and difficult and not always positive, but to make that into literature, I think takes a team, a talent, publishing entity. So I do think it's hard. I don't know if other people have.
Great, thank you. I think that's a good place for us to stop. Chuck, you can ask her your question on your own. And so let's thank Molly for her talk tonight. Thank you very much, Molly.